Now, this is an event which is held each year in March at the UN HQ in New York, and it's when governments, international institutions, and various people from within the women's movement and others supportive of gender equality come together to review progress on the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and now the Sustainable Development Goals. Each year there's a different theme, and this year it's women's economic empowerment and the changing world of work. So in anticipation of that, today we're discussing what needs to be done to create an economy that works for women. In particular, we're hoping to have a discussion and also identify concrete proposals for government action which can be taken to the Commission on the Status of Women in March. So, as always, we of course have our hashtags and our other electronic functions. The hashtag for the event is CSW61, which is the wider hashtag for CSW as well. And you can submit questions for the panel using the webinar function, or which should be on the right of your screen. We'd make really a plea. We've only got an hour, so please keep your questions brief and to the point. And if you are willing, please submit also your name, your organisation, if you're with one, and the country you're from. So, without any further ado, I'm going to move to our first panellist, Dr. Perna Sen, who is Director of Policy at UN Women. Now, Perna, I'd like to ask you, in the context of CSW 61, what are the challenges and opportunities for creating an economy that works for women?
Good morning, Abby. Excuse me. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for holding this seminar. I'm really happy to be part of it. We think it's very important that we use this opportunity of CSW to draw attention to and galvanise efforts around women's economic empowerment. I'd like also to acknowledge the ODI report that you've done on the gig economy and the GAD network publications that you've shared with everybody. And we really see complementarity between these different papers, and hope that together they form a very strong basis for work on women's economic empowerment as we go forward into and from CSW. For UN Women, the issue of achieving women's economic empowerment in the changing world of work, which is the CSW theme, means realising women's rights to work and at work. Rights to decent work, to social protection, freedom of association, they're all vital for all women. And they're essential to fulfilling the mandate of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We know very clearly that those are intrinsic objectives that we seek to fulfill, but we also know that women's economic engagement has benefits that others are looking for too. So the instrumentalist argument is that with women's economic empowerment, global economic change will yield inclusive and equitable growth and generate decent work as a consequence that reduces poverty, improves well-being and livelihoods, and generates sustainable development. Women's economic empowerment is not a standalone objective, excuse me, only in the area of work, because it links very clearly to issues of bodily control, to issues of violence against women, political engagement. All of those are interlinked. So we must see women's economic empowerment as part of an embedded set of changes for women's autonomy. What we do in this department, and my colleagues are here, might join in the discussion later, is we prepare the SG's report, the Secretary General's report, that forms a basis for discussion at CSW. And in this report, we've noted a number of things that I'd like quickly to run through. First of all, the world of work is undergoing rapid transformation that poses both significant challenges and opportunities for women's economic empowerment. We know that violence against women in the world of work increases gender inequalities, and it stymies women's workers' voice and agency. And it also brings high costs to women and lost earnings and well-being. Women also continue to subsidise the market economy through their unpaid care and domestic work, which often fills in for lack of public expenditure on social services and infrastructure. Women and girls' disproportionate burden of unpaid care and domestic work has to be recognised, reduced and redistributed. Thirdly, expanding public and private sector employment and paid jobs in the care economy can make a significant contribution to gender equality and to women's economic empowerment. Such investment in decent work in the care economy could really make a difference to the gender pay gap, to reducing overall inequality, and redressing the exclusion of women from decent jobs. In the care economy, domestic workers, who are overwhelmingly women, should be afforded the same rights and protections as all other workers. That's clearly not happening at the moment. the work of the task of domestic workers is absolutely critical to the functioning of households and society and makes a very significant contribution to the rearing of children and caring for the elderly. I'd also like to say a few words in this context about how our report aligns with the ODI report that's just come out, A Good Gig, the Rise of On-Demand Domestic Work. The concept of the gig economy still is rather northern-centric concept. In developing countries, structural issues, lack of inclusive growth, is why millions of women remain in informality. There, policy should look at transition from informality to formality. Technological and digital changes are creating new types of jobs and enabling new forms of work, but may also lead to the disappearance of some jobs. The potential effects of technological and digital change on jobs and the nature of work have to be anticipated. And only in that way will we ensure that women will be fully equipped with the education, training, and vocational entrepreneurial skills to seek equal outcomes. Over the past 20 years, women's participation in global production has been accompanied by the growing informality of work. As I said, that's something we need to focus on. And even as globalization has brought millions of women into paid labor, it has also reproduced gender inequalities by concentrating women workers at the bottom of global value chains. The lowest paid jobs, piece rate work, subcontracted work, and insecure forms of self-employment, with little or no access to decent work and social protection. Of course, women we know are systematically paid less than men for work of equal value across all regions, all countries, and all sectors. No country yet pays women the same as men. The global gender pay gap is around 23%, and a major cause of overall lifetime inequality between men and women. Of course, the gender gaps are rooted in fundamental power inequalities and structural inequalities between men and women more broadly, and so we need to look at household issues and dynamics as well as those in the world of work. It's not easy to calculate, I mentioned earlier the gig economy, but it's not easy to calculate the number of workers there. But the 11 principal platforms and apps that employ some 21 million workers worldwide, and data shows that women participate in significant numbers in crowd working and other e-services. Most on-demand, here's a real issue, most on-demand and crowd workers are considered self-employed, independent contractors who assume all the potential risks and liabilities of transactions with customers, but with none of the benefits of fundamental rights of work. The gig economy has so far eluded labour protection and employment regulation, although this is beginning to be challenged, as we've seen with the latest, back from London, the latest judicial decision on Uber. We realise very clearly that the full enjoyment of women's economic empowerment and rights requires transformative structural change. These include policies to manage trade and financial globalisation so that these forces profoundly alter the world of work will benefit women. It requires macroeconomic and labour market policies that create decent jobs, protect workers' rights, and generate living wages. I think I'm close to out of time, so I'm just going to end with a couple of points. First of all, women's leadership is absolutely crucial in all of these discussions. Women organising in workplaces and communities is absolutely indispensable for upholding fundamental labour rights, ensuring decent work, and defining policy priorities. We must both focus on economic, including macro issues and policies, and on linkages between different sectors, as I've signalled. We also want to make use of the SG's high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, to capture the profiling and political importance that's been given to this issue. So we have to make the most of that, and the HLP will present its final report in system. We must together consider what follow-up actions we want to see from that panel, and we must also recognise employment through economic empowerment. We want to create the conditions in which women have control over their lives, and that must obtain in economic life too. Our concerns are with rights, women's rights, justice and dignity in and beyond the world of work. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Perna. Apologies there, just a slight technical hitch, but we're back on. Speaking of technical hitches, I am afraid that Musindarwezo from FEMNET, who was due to join us, it appears that she is also subject to technical hitches. We're working really hard behind the scenes to try and bring her online to you, so we really hope to be able to do that as soon as possible. In the meantime, I'm going to hand over to James Heintz, who is Associate Director of the Political Economy Research Institute, and Andrew Glyn, Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Quite a mouthful, I hope I said that correctly. What I'm going to ask you, James, is why is macroeconomic policy important for gender equality? And what should governments do to create an enabling macroeconomic environment?
Okay, great. It's great being here this morning. And thanks for the organizers for bringing me in on this webinar. In terms of addressing this issue of macroeconomic policy, when we talk about macroeconomic policy, it's broad brushstroke policy, categories of policy such as fiscal policy that deals with budgets, taxation, debts and deficits, and monetary policy, the role of the financial sector and the central bank in the economy. So those are the issues that I have in mind when I'm talking about macroeconomic policy. And I'm going to draw a lot on the last Progress of the World's Women publication that I had the honor of working on from UN Women, the 2015-2016 Progress of the World's Women, that had a lot of work on thinking about the role of macroeconomic policy and gender equality. I think it's important to start off by saying what macroeconomic policy can and cannot do. Macroeconomic policy is a fairly blunt tool, and it by itself cannot necessarily advance gender equality, or necessarily it doesn't by itself contribute to gender inequality on the other side. But what macroeconomic policy can do is it can affect the ability and the constraints under which other types of interventions, other types of policies can operate, and their ability to actually advance and achieve gender inequality. So to just give you an example, austerity policies, such as those that have been rolled out in Europe, those are policies that cut government spending. Those policies, there's a lot of work, for instance, in the UK, showing that those policies have a disproportionate impact on women. It's not the budget cuts themselves that have the disproportionate impact on women. It's about the structural realities of the economy, that different areas of spending affect men and women differently. So macroeconomic policy kind of affect the overall envelope of resources that are available, but by themselves, they do not necessarily address those structural inequalities in the economy. But what they do is they would affect the resources available to enact other policies that actually address gender inequality and advance gender equality. So what we really want to think about macroeconomic policy doing is creating that type of enabling environment and mobilizing resources that then can be used to channel towards interventions that actually advance gender equality. And so, as I said, the current trend towards without necessarily any type of analysis of the distributive impact of those policies on men and women are not necessarily going to advance gender equality. So we need to be able to review those policies, review macroeconomic policies for their impact on men and women and on the goals of advancing gender equality. Another issue, I'm going to talk about three issues. That was the first one, just the role of macroeconomic policies in creating this enabling environment. The second issue is really looking at macroeconomic policy variables and how they systematically either devalue or the economic contribution of women. And yet these policy variables that are out there, how they're constructed, are actually the basis for assessing the success or failure of macroeconomic policies. But if they themselves exclude large areas of the economy that are important in terms of structuring gender inequality, then they're going to be biased tools. They're not going to take that into account. So a really clear example that everyone often raises in this context is the measurement of GDP, gross domestic product. It excludes the unpaid care economy in its calculations. It excludes it by definition. And so as women have, they allocate a huge amount of their own labor to productive activities in the household, but these are unpaid, non-market activities that are not included in GDP. But you read, most macroeconomic strategies, the policy goals coming out of major institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and they're all focused on economic growth. But economic growth is defined in terms of the expansion of GDP. So it does not include this area of economic activity. So if your policy objectives and the way you're measuring success excludes all of that, then you are systematically excluding from just a formulation and the measurement of macroeconomic activity this huge area and this source of gender inequality. We can also think about it in terms of the care economy in general. Thinking about childcare, for instance. In macroeconomic analysis and how macroeconomic variables are measured, one important distinction is what is consumption expenditure and what is investment in the future. In the way that macroeconomic variables are currently constructed, spending of time and money on children is considered a consumption expenditure, just as if you're buying a new car or some new clothes, something like that. It's not counted as a long-run investment in the economy. And so if we really want to build the care economy and think about how to reorient macroeconomic policies to be able to do that, we have to recognize that investment in the care economy is a long-run investment with long-run implications. It's not like current consumption. It's not like a choice of whether to go out to dinner tonight or not. It's really needs to be rethought and reclassified. Until that's done, the policy objectives are going to be skewed. There's going to be a focus on investment, but investment is only defined in terms of kind of plant and equipment of the private sector, physical infrastructure, and so forth, but not these human types of investment. And so again, we have a kind of a biased macroeconomic policy just by the way the variables of macroeconomic policy are defined. So that needs to be changed in order to make macroeconomic policy work towards promoting gender equality. The third thing I want to mention is just the instrumental issue that was raised already, which is, and this is very important because large, influential international institutions that had never paid attention to gender equality in the past, and by this I mean the World Bank and the IMF that have an enormous impact on policy formulation throughout the world, have now discovered gender equality, and they're very excited about it. But they've discovered it in a very particular way. They say that we need to promote gender equality purely because of its instrumental role. They say gender equality is smart economics because if you promote gender equality, you're going to get economic growth. Now, I've already talked about why economic growth, defining your policy objectives in terms of economic growth, is problematic already. But let's just take it at its face value. There's two issues. One issue is when does gender equality actually impact economic growth, and how does that analysis actually work? And the other one is, are there situations where gender inequality actually contributes to the current type of economic growth and performance? That second question is completely ignored by the World Bank and the IMF. So the first question, why do they think gender equality contributes to economic growth? Well, usually there's two examples that they give. One is gender parity in education. So if you have parity in terms of primary education, studies have shown that this contributes to economic growth. Second one is women's labor force participation. And women's labor force participation is a big one. You hear about it all the time. If you get more women into the labor market, then it contributes to economic growth. So let me take that second one, labor force participation. It's almost true by definition because economic growth is defined in terms of GDP, And so if women are moving out of the unpaid sector, which is not counted in GDP, and they're moving into the paid sector, which is counted in GDP, of course it's going to raise GDP. The question is that they're no longer necessarily going to do as much of that unpaid work that they were doing. So what impact does that actually have on the care economy? When that reallocation of labor from unpaid to paid work? How do we actually assess, that whole area of the economy that's very important for sustaining our society, but is excluded from these variables? So just focusing on women's labor force participation and economic growth hides a lot of those dynamics because it does not address the costs of women moving from unpaid to paid work. It doesn't do that because it implicitly assumes that whatever women were doing before they entered their the labor market was worthless. It wasn't valued economically. And so when you hear those types of instrumentalist arguments from the IMF and World Bank, we really need to think more broadly about, what is not included in our analysis of the macroeconomy. Now, the second point, does gender inequality contribute to economic growth? Does it underpin some of these models of economic growth? And I would argue that one of the most important sources, at least in terms of economic empowerment of gender inequality, is the unequal distribution of unpaid care work in the economy that really constrains women's choices. It makes them more vulnerable. It reduces their ability to get adequate earnings in the labor market, and that makes them more dependent on private transfers in the household, relying on a male breadwinner, and so forth. But that the care that happens in the household, and this has been shown, is so important for sustaining the economy in the long run. Who's going to produce the next generation of workers? Who's going to produce the next generation of human resources that is really fundamental to our economic performance? It's really rooted in unpaid care work, but that's a source of gender inequality. So the entire economy, kind of the growth model that we have, is assuming that care is going to be forthcoming, that unpaid care work is there. It assumes that gender division of labor that is a root cause of gender inequality is just kind of natural, or it's part of the whole story, but it's promoting economic growth. So you have there a very clear situation where gender inequality and a very important structural source of gender inequality is just assumed to be part of the current macroeconomic model. And so we have to challenge that as well. I am out of time, but those were my 3 points I wanted to make.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to check in with my colleagues. We thought we had Dinah on the line. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that she has been able to join us at this moment. So I'm going to take this as a really great opportunity. Oh, hang on. I think I've just heard Dinah.
Hi. So I can hear. Hello, everyone. So I can hear everyone, but I'm not able to connect my webcam, so I'm sure you can't see me, but I can see you. So I'm not sure if I can go ahead with just audio.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're really delighted to have you on. Great to hear you. And the line, even better news, the line is really clear. So although we can't see you, we can absolutely certainly hear you. So let's focus on the positive. Absolutely. Just for those who don't know who you are, Dinah Musindarwezo is joining us. She is the Executive Director of the African Women's Development and Communication Network, better known by many as FEMNET. So Dinah, what I'd like to do is ask you, from the perspective of a women's rights organisation, what are the priority areas for attention in relation to changing work patterns, unpaid care work and government spending? Over to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me on this important discussion. The organization I work for, FEMNET, which is a feminist women's rights organization and also a regional organization in Africa. This is one of our priority areas that we have been working around, and really most of the issue that we have been that the first panelist spoke about resonate with our work and what we are trying to advance and to achieve. And so the priorities I'm going to share are under the three areas are actually those that have been discussed in different forums of women's rights organizations that are really critical in achieving women's economic rights. And so, first of all, the overreaching priority under this theme is really to transform the structural barriers. As you have heard from the first speakers, I think already the macroeconomic framework and the way it is structured, it is that has structural barriers to women's economic justice and economic rights. And so if you look at the fact that, you know, the work that is predominantly done by women, and that's unpaid care work, is not even in the calculation of GDP of countries, already that shows how the macroeconomic system actually is excluding already labor that women spend so much time doing. So how the first priority is really to transform the structural barriers, and that includes addressing gender inequalities that lead to these, to the way the framework is structured. But also eliminating discrimination against women that also drives the unequal opportunities, that drives unpaid care work, that drives unequal pay for men and women, and for young women, and that is definitely lower than that of young women. And so if really you look at issues around addressing gender inequalities, that would definitely have inroad into achieving labor rights, into achieving women as equal participants in the economy, and ensuring that, you know, that they don't just have jobs, but the jobs are decent, that they are satisfying, and that women are able to be leaders and decision makers in the world of work. And specifically under unpaid care work, so the priorities we have been pushing for, of course, are 3 R's, and that is recognition of unpaid care work. And recognizing unpaid care work means actually measuring that unpaid care work, understanding how much work is done by who, how much it is contributing to the economy. It is possible, there is other methodology on how to measure unpaid care work, but countries need to invest in that work if they want to really recognize and value unpaid care work. The other aspect is around redistribution. So redistributing unpaid care work in ensuring that, you know, work is shared between men and women in the household, boys and girls, but that also it is shared with the states and families, and also with the private sector. And that what that really means is that there has to be one change in social norms, which then will allow work to be shared between men and women, because it is because of gender social norms that you find that different societies, different cultures, different religious beliefs will believe that that work is supposed to be done by women, by girls. But if we invest in changing social norms and beliefs, then the sharing between men and women will happen. But also the states, we need to do a lot of work with the states, with the private sector, for them to invest in this work, you know, through parental leave, through investing in social protection, child care, elderly care, and those kind of things, the energy saving, cooking methodologies, and technologies, you know, that will actually reduce the amount of unpaid care work. But also we need to invest more in evidence gathering, because you find that most of the arguments around unpaid care work is based on social beliefs, on religious beliefs, on traditional beliefs. And often you find we don't have enough evidence to convince policymakers. I think there is a need to invest more in gathering evidence, so that when we are advocating for all these things around transforming the structural barriers, we do so with evidence. And the other thing, of course, is around advocacy and influencing national policies and programs in terms of resource allocation. even going with the most recent development framework, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it's very clear that there has been a little bit of a shift in terms of recognizing unpaid care work by the fact that it made it under Goal 5. But again, the way it is framed, it again shows that, you know, there is still the cultural barriers around it, and they have left it to the country to decide whether actually this is important or not important. And so there is a lot of work to be done to frame unpaid care work in the policies, both at the global level, at the regional level, and at the national level. In terms of government spending, definitely, I think when we talk about government spending, we need to look at both the income but also the expenditure side, because I think women's rights organizations over time have focused a lot on the expenditure side. A lot of work has been done around gender budgeting, but not much has been done around looking at the income generation, on wealth accumulation, and how that happens, and the impact it has on women's human rights. And so as women's rights organization, again, we are prioritizing looking at both sides, the income side, the wealth accumulation side, but also the expenditure side, so that the processes such as, you know, such as tax generation, the process is not actually abusing and violating women's rights, but it is done in a way that advances women's human rights, because after all, they also pay taxes. But also then looking at the expenditure side and really ensuring that women and women's organizations and different groups are actually participating in the budget processes, in the national planning processes, and they are influencing that in terms of how income are generated and shared, and that they are efficiently and effectively used to advance well-being of all people in different countries, and also that they are shared in equitable and fair way. In terms of the changing work patterns, of course, we know that the work patterns have really kept changing over time. In terms of, you know, we are seeing the informal sector increasing, and we know that majority of people concentrating in the informal sector are women. And we know that the informal sector, the problem with the informal sector is that, you know, it lacks job security. First of all, it is concentrated with no contracts, with no being able to voice and organize as workers. And so, again, by the fact that it's majority of women in the informal sector, and yet the informal sector is not regulated in a way that people working in the informal sector have their rights protected, is problematic. And so we again prioritize in terms of ensuring that that is done, but also ensuring that actually women in the informal sector also enjoy decent work.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dinah. What I'd like to do is just remind everyone that's watching us that you can pose questions to our panel. We've heard from our three panelists. We'll shortly hear from Jessica Woodruff. What you can do is send them by text in the panel. Should be to the right of your screen. Again, a bit of a call out, please do make them short and to the point, and include, if you're willing to, your name, organisation, if you have one, and the country you're from. Let's just pick up briefly on the different reports that have been mentioned, in case anyone's interested about those. Our report on A Good Gig, the rise of on-demand domestic work, is available also on the panel to the right of your screen, as are publications from the Gender and Development Network, and the reports from UN Women that Perna mentioned. She mentioned the progress of the world's women. That's quite easily findable online. There we go. That's quite easily findable online by searching Progress of the World's Women. I think that one's the Transforming Economies, Realising Rights. And any of the documents for CSW 61 have been really helpfully compiled together by UN Women on the CSW 61 webpage. And there you'll find some of the background information about the programme, the Secretary General's report as well that's been mentioned. So do have a look at those if you're interested in more information. So I'm going to hand over now to Jessica Woodruff, who is the Director of the Gender and Development Network here in the UK. As I just mentioned, the publications that you'll see on the side of your screen from GADNet are part of a major project that they are carrying out on gender and macroeconomics. So what I'd like to do, Jess, is hand over to you for your thoughts on the discussion so far and any particular points that are most relevant as we move forward into CSW.
Thanks, Abby. We're sitting next to each other, which is why we keep looking to the sides of our screen. Thank you. We're sitting next to each other, which is why we keep looking to our left or right. I'm just going to make 5 points. I'd like to start off with Perna's presentation, because as you mentioned, Perna, we have CSW coming up, which is focusing on women's economic empowerment. And I just wondered whether you could come back when we get to the round of questions, just to maybe say a bit more about what you see as the potential wins that we could perhaps have at CSW, but also at the other UN gatherings like the High Level Political Forum. And is it time now for a kind of breakthrough on unpaid care? And also, what are the really tricky issues? What are the ones where we're less likely to make traction on and that we're going to have to keep pushing on? Because we were in some ways sort of taken by surprise that unpaid care made it into the SDGs. That was great. But it's just sort of useful, I think, for people on the webinar to know where we should put our energies. The second point, which is something that I'm sure we all agree with, but that in the discussions around making economies work for women or women's economic empowerment, quite often there is not priority given to the most marginalized women or to the women who are facing intersecting discriminations, whether it's on the ground of class or race or disability or age. And sometimes if we do prioritize the needs of those women, we have come up with different solutions. And I think certainly looking perhaps at the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, some of the solutions that are being put forward are perhaps more to do with wealthier women in the north than marginalized women in both north and south. And that's something that we just need to bear in the back of our minds. I think following from that, for example, one of the things that we might look at more is universal access to social protection. If we're thinking more about the most marginalized women. And this brings me on to my third point, which was following from what James said about using instrumentalist arguments. And that's obviously something that we're all tackling with, all of us, all the time. To what extent do we use instrumentalist arguments to broaden our audience, and to what extent do we stick to our guns and say, no, women's economic empowerment is important because it's important. And I do agree with what James said, that there's been a real focus on female labour force participation, which basically means how many women have got jobs, which is not the same as gender equality or empowering women. That most of the jobs that women, certainly in the global south, are going to get are going to be in the informal sector. They're going to be unregulated. They're not going to be an adequate living wage. They're not going to have secure conditions. And as James said, I think this is a really important point to follow up on. I think the other reason why simply looking at female labour force participation is not a good idea is that we want women's economic empowerment for those people who aren't in paid employment as well as for those people who are. And again, that might bring us back to looking at universal social protection and other issues like that. But there's a danger of if we're simply talking about getting women into jobs, we ignore the large number of women who aren't in paid employment. And that's why also, the concept of decent work is so important, is that where we are getting women into jobs, we need to make sure that those jobs are decent, that they have good conditions, adequate pay, and so on. And then my fourth point was coming back to what Dinah was saying about unpaid care work. And that does seem to me one of the potential breakthrough issues at the moment, but it's a very big issue. So we heard from both James and Dinah about the importance of recognizing unpaid care in macroeconomic policy making, and the austerity cuts, which particularly hit the care sectors, are a really clear example of that. But my other concern around talking about unpaid care is that certainly in CSWs that I've been to in the past, there's been a lot of talk about the redistribution of unpaid care from women to men, which is basically about men looking after their own kids. And this is obviously important, but it's a very partial solution, and it's a solution that is probably more relevant to richer households than to poorer households. In poorer households, you're going to have a much higher burden of unpaid care. There are people who can't afford technology or paid help, who have higher disease burdens, who have less social protection. And so for those poorer households, investment in public services is going to be absolutely key. And I think it's really important that in addition to talking about changing social norms, we always talk about the importance of investing in public care services as part of the discussion around unpaid care. And that brings me to my fifth point, which is that central to all of this discussion is the role of governments. And our job in holding governments to account for promoting gender equality. And CSW is essentially a platform for governments, and we have to remember that. There is, I think, sometimes an over-reliance on markets and on private actors to redistribute wealth and to promote gender equality. And in some ways, this is letting governments off the hook. There may be a role for private sector, but that can't be the main driving force. The other thing that we see is even where governments are willing to create what James was referring to as an enabling macroeconomic environment, to create the conditions where gender equality can flourish, quite often they're prevented from doing so because of the policies of the World Bank and the IMF, and also because, in some instances because of trade agreements. And we need to ensure that the policy space is there so that governments can, if they're willing, pursue the creation of macroeconomic environments. And I wanted to finish on the point that James alluded to, because there are real things that governments could do. And one of the things that James mentioned was about investing in social infrastructure. And this is really important because if it's recognised that care services are an investment, not social spending, then governments are allowed to borrow in order to invest in that social infrastructure. And this is a three-way win because it can create decent work, particularly for women, it can reduce women's unpaid care burden, and it can provide better care for the whole of society. So this is a kind of really practical example where some of the things that James was talking about can translate into a completely feasible thing that governments could do in order to create a better macroeconomic environment for gender equality. And I think so that's really what I sort of wanted to finish on, is that I think it's time now for us to reclaim economic policy. Too often, the pursuit of gender equality is seen as something that is to be done by social policy experts. And we need to get the pursuit of gender equality bang into the middle of discussion around macroeconomic policy. And CSW is perhaps a place to start on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. We're going to move straight on now into the questions. We've had quite a few through, so thanks to everyone online. Please do keep them coming. What I'm going to ask to our panellists, please do keep your answers as short and succinct as possible. We would really like to get round to a second round of questions, and even a third. You never know how we might get on. So I'm going to move straight into those. We've got, I think, quite a clear question came out there, but a very important one, given the topic of the webinar. What are the potential wins at CSW and beyond? We've had another question in from Saloni from the ILO. Can micro, small and medium enterprises become a way for women to create decent work opportunities for themselves, and what obstacles might there be there? And we've also had a question in from Diana at Oxfam Canada, asking what would be the best way to explain the steps needed to invest in the care economy to policymakers. We are often met with blank stares. That's a bit of an insight there from the experience of Oxfam Canada. Thanks for that. So I'm going to hand over first to Perna to invite really please some brief comments. Thank you.
Sorry, can you hear me? I think I was muted. I started to talk. Okay, I'll try and be as brief as I can, but there's quite a few questions there with quite a lot of substance. Maybe we'll share them out. I don't know how you want to do it, Abby. On the potential wins, which is a really important question from Jessica, but also on tricky issues, can I just say, I think in some ways we need to make the most of the momentum that's been given by the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, because it does have constituents from the private sector, from NGOs, from UN agencies, and from the IFIs, and of course from member states. So what they come up with, what they've been able to progress in terms of consensus is really critical for us to take forward. But of course, that's just what consensus between those constituencies can produce, and at CSW we need to take it further. So I think the gains that have been done, one in terms of recognition of what happens in the informal sector and women's experiences there is something that has progressed under the HLP. We need to move that forward. Secondly, I think there's been a shift on the care economy. We need to solidify that and think about how we can move that forward. Discussion of paid and unpaid work there needs to be central. And I also think a really important thing that's come up, such an important theme today, is we will have, I want to call it a minimal agenda on macroeconomics, agreed through all those constituencies through the HLP. But we all know how that framing, that enabling environment, has to be the key to unlocking all the other things we're talking about in terms of decent work and social protection, etc., etc. So what I would like to see is that we use this opportunity in CSW and the high-level political forum, which you also made reference to, Jessica, to push member states on commitments that the high-level panel has brought a political energy to, and getting some firm commitments. Just to say on that, there are draft agreed conclusions available on CSW already. Your member states all have them. I think there's a great task to be done by NGOs, women's rights advocates, and so on, to talk to your governments about how they take those forward at CSW. I'm not going to go through the tricky ones because I think there probably isn't time, Abby. Do you want me to leave the other two questions to the other panelists?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, unless there's anything really completely burning that you would like to add.
Well, there are three things we think are real game changers that we need to galvanise our energies on. One, unpaid care work, but also paid domestic work, and actually the distribution of domestic and care work altogether. The shift from informality to formality, and the macroeconomic and gender work. What we will do after CSW, after the high-level panel, remember it's only 1 year, is we will, as UN Women, want to think about how we take that macro and gender discussion forward, and we really look forward to working with people, not only on the panel, but those who are in the, perhaps in the broader webinar and beyond, to try and put gender in the centre of those discussions.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move over now to Dinah. Hopefully you can still hear us there. Dinah, we've got a question on the potential wins at CSW, and you, a veteran yourself of CSW and surrounding fora, so I'm quite interested from your point of view, what are the potential wins at CSW and beyond?
Okay. I think the potential wins will definitely focus a lot on the wins in the SDGs, given that it is the newest framework around that also talks about economic women's empowerment. And there's a likelihood to have language around economic empowerment being pushed as opposed to economic rights for women. And definitely member states and other stakeholders being comfortable with economic empowerment language, but not with economic rights. So that's something we need to look out for and ensure that actually we push for the agreed language around economic rights for women and girls. And when I say that there will be a focus around the win around unpaid care work in the SDGs, actually that target under Goal 5 is not the strongest one, because it says in line with appropriate national policies and laws. So it means it gives governments leeway to choose to take up that target if they think it is not appropriate in their context or in line with their national policies. And yet actually the global setting we expected was to ask member states, UN member states, to come up with the policies and the laws that would ensure transformation around unpaid care work within the macroeconomic policies. So I think, so there will be a win in a way that, there will be some language around women's economic empowerment, there will be some language around unpaid care work. To what extent that will be so transformative will depend on how hard we push.
Thank you. Great example there of a short and succinct answer. Well done. So James, I'm going to move over to you there. We've got a couple of questions in. We've spoken a little bit now about the potential wins at CSW. We also had questions in around micro, small and medium enterprises and whether they could be a route to decent work opportunities. We also had a question about the best way to explain the steps needed to invest in the care economy to policymakers. So I'm quite interested in your thoughts on either of those.
Let me say a few things about the micro, small, and medium enterprise question. I think this speaks to kind of a very important issue of self-employment as a form of employment for women, and not just wage employment when we think about access to decent work and access to paid work. And self-employment in a lot of countries actually accounts for the majority of women's paid employment. It's not all wage employment. Wage employment dominates high-income countries, but you look at low-income countries, it's a lot of self-employment. So if we're looking at the question of micro enterprises, small and medium enterprises, and in terms of gender equality types of issues, one of the biggest issues is that these enterprises, these forms of self-employment, are incredibly segregated. They're segregated in terms of size of enterprise, and they're segregated in terms of the occupations that women are either allowed to do or choose to do because of customs and norms. So if you look at the data, on self-employment, informal self-employment of women, and you look at the size of the enterprises, almost all women are on the micro end of these enterprises. They're not in the small enterprises. They're not in the medium enterprises in terms of actually operating them, owning them. And when I say micro, I mean very micro. The enterprises are the women working by themselves or maybe with some family members with them, called own account workers. And so we have to ask the question, this is a very precarious informal employment. It's a dominant form of precarious informal employment. And so we have to ask the question, whether that reality, getting women into, these very small enterprises, is actually kind of a long-run strategy to economic empowerment, and what else needs to be done, because the income and the working conditions in these very, very small enterprises aren't good. One of the big barriers that's always raised in terms of moving anyone, individuals, but particularly women, from very small enterprises to, let's say, higher value-added activities or higher, bigger enterprises, those types of issues is access to finance and access to financial resources. And here I think the policy response or the strategies that have been adopted basically reinforce the segregation that we see and are a big barrier, because the policy response to, financial barriers for enterprise development tends to be microfinance. So women need access to microfinance, these small-scale loans, and so on. There's a whole debate over microfinance. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not. I don't want to go into those issues right now because of lack of time. But I think the big question is, why are we leaving out what I would call the macrofinance, the role of the financial sector? So getting back to kind of the macroeconomic issues, that there's this whole issue of a huge amount of resources in the banking sector, in the formal banking sector, in formal financial institutions. Those resources are not being channeled towards women's economic empowerment. Instead, we say women need microfinance, and we're letting off the hook the whole question of the entire financial sector of these economies and holding them to account. And I think we really have to start thinking bigger in terms of this. So if you want to knock down the barriers to women advancing from micro enterprises to small enterprises and maybe up to medium enterprises and give them the resources to make that happen, it's not going to happen through microfinance. You need to bring in the rest of the financial sector.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Now, I'm just going to come back briefly to Jessica. The question we had in the last one, what would be the best way to explain the steps needed to invest in the care economy to policymakers? So what I'd love is for your elevator pitch to policymakers on why we should be investing in the care economy.
Okay, I'll be sitting smiling sweetly. Abby smiles sweetly at me as though that's a reasonable question. I'm not gonna quite answer that question, but I think perhaps I'm going to say what I think we should stop doing, which is, in order to try to get unpaid care onto the agenda, we've lumped together a whole lot of things under the heading of unpaid care and oversimplified it. And I think now it's now on the agenda. And that means that we can now start being a bit more sophisticated about the way that we describe it. And I think the first thing is that we have to start talking about the care economy, which covers many of the things that James was talking about the way in which women's unpaid care and domestic work actually contributes to the productive economy. We just have to start talking about that in the same way as we started talking about the impact of women's unpaid care work on their own empowerment. I don't think there is an elevator pitch, to be honest, but I think we've left that more complex bit out of the discussion, and I think we have to reintegrate it again. I think the other thing that we need to reintegrate is, as we did with violence against women's issues, is that care is not a culturally sensitive issue. And as Dinah said, it was the only one of the SDG targets that where there was a clause about policies that were appropriate to national plans. And I think we have to argue back about that care is not a personal domestic issue, it's a public issue, it's a public good, and it's something that public services need to provide. So I think that's not an elevator pitch, but I think it's about us reframing how we talk about unpaid care and bringing the complexity back into it.
Thank you, Jessica. Now I'm going to do a short round of questions to finish the webinar. We've got some questions in that are very practically focused. So we've had quite a few that are asking for really quite practical examples of how we do this. So I'm going to ask everyone in your final comments to just think about some good examples in response to the couple of questions. The first one that we've had in is, how do we get data on women's contribution in the care economy to aid macroeconomic planning for developing countries? It's quite a specific one there. We've also had a question in to Dinah, but I think it might be relevant to others as well if they have examples. Can you give us some examples of African countries that might be good campaign targets to be pushed on firm commitments at CSW? And then we've had a final question in from our colleague here at ODI, Caroline Harper, saying change can often be an add-on. So, for example, people might be saying, let's give a bit of maternity or paternity leave and then we've addressed discrimination in the workplace. However, changing gendered social norms is important because it's at the core of what needs to change, which is individual and institutional attitudes and practice. So the question there is, what's the panel's experience of getting to the core of attitudes when it comes to women's economic empowerment? So I'm going to ask you all for a very brief summary. You can choose one of those questions, and if you can't think of any great examples that you'd like to bring to the fore, then perhaps you could finish with any closing remarks that you have on the discussion today. So I'll go in the same order as before. I'll move first to Perna, please.
Abby, forgive me if I missed some of the questions, but I'm just going to start off with the capturing the care work and unpaid work, right? That was the first question. Yeah, so what we would really want to see, obviously, is time use surveys. We don't have enough capturing of what women actually do, how much time is allocated to the work that they do, and only in that way, when we get that data, will we be able to document and to use that for advocacy and for policy change. The second one, was there one about norms? I missed a little bit of your question, I'm sorry. So yeah, agreed. I think you said that if we change paternity and maternity leave regulations, we think the job's done, but actually men are less likely to take stuff up because of gendered behaviours, right? Yeah. So absolutely, and I mean, Jessica's point about oversimplifying is absolutely valid to a lot of the things we're talking about. And while we have to push for a changed set of regulations, a changed set of possibilities for men and women, what we have to do is firstly still address the norms through which their behaviour is determined, but also not neglect the fact that there are structural issues underlying these particular patterns. So it's both a question of norm change and around structural change. And just as a quick ending, as a result of the high-level panel and its demise in March, there's a possibility, and we'll need to announce this at CSW if it goes ahead, that we will have some specific work around norm change and women's economic empowerment. So watch this space on that one.
Thank you. Over to James. We've got a question that seems made for you in a way here. How do we get data on women's contribution in the care economy to aid macroeconomic planning?
The answer was already given. You need time use surveys and more of them. You need time use surveys in countries that don't have this data in order to measure the care economy, the unpaid care economy in particular. But also having repeated time use surveys over time is very useful. So you can see if you're making progress in different areas. So, you know, countries like India and South Africa have time use surveys, but they've done them once. We need to have them done as a routine type of survey, just like you do labor force surveys. I'd also say that you need to relook at labor force surveys to make sure they're adequately capturing women's paid employment and the employment that's done as a contribution on the paid side to the care economy, because a lot of that employment, even though labor force surveys have been out there for a long time, is still undercounted, particularly women's labor force participation in their contribution through paid employment. So we need another look at that.
Great, thank you. And over to Dinah now. Any examples of African countries that might be good campaign targets to be pushed on firm commitments at CSW? So who's leading the way?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, in terms of economic rights or economic empowerment generally, at least we know that the Africa Working Group will be progressive because it tends to. But again, we need to be careful that, of course, they will push for like increasing women in labor force and those kind of things. But in terms of unpaid care work, I would say Rwanda, because it already has a policy around unpaid care work. So I think it will be a good, a quick win in terms of the commitment they can make around that. But I would say that, most of the African countries would really need evidence in justifying why they should invest in unpaid care work and why it should be made a priority. And so I think some of the countries we can then focus on this CSW would be countries that are going to be reporting during the HLPF in July for the implementation of the SDGs as like the first kind of countries to target, because then they would make sure that they do something before July, before HLPF, around the target on unpaid care work.
Thank you. Really nice practical steps there. And last but certainly not least, I'm going to hand over to Jessica for any final very few words you have.
Okay, I'm going to take us away from the practical because I was struck by something that Dinah said. And I think that it's an exciting time because women's economic empowerment is, for once, really on the political agenda. But the danger of that, as we know, is that one's issue can be co-opted, can be compromised, can be confused, can be oversimplified. And I do wonder whether it's time to start referring to women's economic rights again, rather than women's economic empowerment, as a way of reclaiming this agenda and putting forward many of the things that we've discussed in the webinar.
Thank you. Okay, well, all it remains to say thank you so much to all of our panelists who have taken time out of their really busy days to join us. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who has joined us online. We were really pleased that so many of you have been able to join us from around the world. The recording of the webinar, I am assured, will be up, if not this afternoon, certainly by this evening UK time. You can continue to engage on Twitter under the CSW61 hashtag, which will of course remain live throughout CSW itself. And I think the last word I'll leave it on is that both GADNet and ODI will be at CSW in March. Do reach out to us and we look forward to seeing many of you there. Thanks everyone.